Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with the first of a few planned videos for Nonfiction November this year. I thought in honor of Nonfiction November, I would do a few videos suggesting some of my favorite nonfiction titles on some of my favorite historical figures. I don't normally read nonfiction unless it is historical nonfiction. And so I just thought, looking back over the years at some of my favorite nonfiction books, they've always been about my favorite historical figures. So I thought I would do a series of videos this year where I recommended some nonfiction for some of my favorite historical figures. And of course, we're going to kick off this whole project with my favorite historical figure, my man Richard III. Please excuse my voice because I am coming down from literally the worst cold of my life. I do have my water here, so hopefully I can get through this without going into a coughing fit and keeping my voice a little bit strong. But I'm kind of tired of sitting around waiting to feel better, so I thought I would go on and start filming today. So Richard III is my favorite historical figure. If you've been around on my channel for any length of time, I'm sure you know that. And I'm actually shocked when I looked back at my video catalog that I had never done a video recommending anything on him. I do have historical fiction, kind of Wars of the Roses recommendations, which I guess you could just call Richard III recommendations. And I think it's because really I enjoy Richard a little bit more in the historical fiction realm than I do in nonfiction. And it's because Richard is a very controversial figure. So if you know nothing about Richard III and you just want a little bit of context about why he is so controversial, he was the King of England from 1483 to 1485, a relatively short time period, all things considered. And he became the king during a period of English history that we call the Wars of the Roses, which was an English civil war between technically two families, the Yorks and the Lancasters. So Richard is of the York family, and his older brother Edward was also the King of England. So the controversy comes in when Edward dies suddenly rather young, a little bit earlier than anyone thought that he would die. He has two young sons. The eldest would be the king after him, another Edward, Edward V. Everyone in this story has the same name. The Wars of the Roses are literally just a group of people all named Margaret, Elizabeth, Richard, and Edward. I'm serious. So Edward IV, Richard's brother, dies, and on his deathbed he says, I want Richard to be the Lord Protector for these boys. I want him to look out for them, especially my son Edward, who's going to be the king. This doesn't really fly well with Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, the current Queen of England. She has a really large family, and she kind of thinks one of her brothers should have gotten this. Richard, meanwhile, is up in the north of England. He doesn't even really know this is going on yet. So he becomes the Lord Protector for these boys. And everything is put about that there's going to be a coronation for Edward V sometime in June of 1483. There are movements being made, the party's planned, everything's moving forward, and then the date passes and the coronation never happened. To really pare down the story, the two princes are put into the Tower of London, and Richard announces that actually these boys are illegitimate and they're not princes at all because his brother Edward was technically already married when he married Elizabeth Woodville. That makes any children with her kind of illegitimate, and thus they can't be in the line of succession, period. You know what that means. Good old Richard is now the first in the succession line. And so he actually goes forward. He becomes the king. The two princes remain in the Tower of London, and they're seen for a little bit, but eventually they disappear and nothing is ever heard from them again. So the big controversy with Richard is, did he kill them or not? And so most of the nonfiction that we deal with when we're talking about Richard III is going to talk about this question of the princes in the tower. Did he kill them? If he didn't, who did? Because they are clearly dead, and Richard came to the throne in a very roundabout sort of way. The question on the side of people who are pro-Richard, and you might can imagine that's me, I am Ricardian, the question there is, you've already had these kids declared as illegitimate, so why bother killing them? So most nonfiction that talks about Richard is talking about the question of the princes in the tower at length. And so that's kind of where I'm always wary in terms of recommending books on Richard, because everyone has a bias in one way or another. Either you are pro-Richard and you don't think he did it, or you are very anti-Richard and you think he's just a murderer and a really lousy guy, let's say, because Richard did some other questionable things throughout his reign. In 1485, Richard meets Henry Tudor on the battlefield and he loses. And so that's basically when his life ends and when his reign ends. And so the Tudor dynasty takes over and they start to rewrite the legacy of the Yorkist kings, specifically of Richard. And so you might can imagine this is when the narrative comes about that Richard is a murderer. It's interesting because even during Henry VII's reign, there is a question of what happened to the princes. People come up who claim that they are one of the princes in the tower, and nobody can say that they aren't because the bodies have never been produced. So this is really one of history's greatest mysteries. And in this series, I wanted to also talk about some primary sources, stuff that was written at the time about these people. And Richard is really, really hard. There's not a lot that remains from this kind of late medieval period. The closest we can come in terms of a primary source is something that is not pro-Richard at all. And that is something that was written by Dominic Mancini, and it's called either The Usurpation of the Throne by Richard III, or it's just in general called The Occupation of the Throne by Richard III, if you want to be a little bit more forgiving. Dominic Mancini, as you might can assume from hearing his name, he's an Italian who was at court during Richard's reign, but he was there prior to Richard's reign and also after. And so one of his claims to fame, really why he has continued to be referenced as a source, is that he really did get to speak with the doctor for the princes. And so this man, Dr. Augustine, was the doctor the princes had when they were in the tower. He rose fairly high during the reign of Henry VII, and so some people will question his testimony at all. But he kind of claims that the princes were being forgotten about, and then one day they're just not there at all. So he kind of says, hey, I think they were murdered. Dominic Mancini is one of the earliest pieces of nonfiction that we have on Richard III, and it's not pro-Richard at all. He's a really interesting figure because some people question the amount of English that he actually knew. So some people don't take him seriously as a source at all, but some people really, really like him and have used him as a source ad nauseum. Many modern historians still use Dominic Mancini because in some ways he's basically all we have. But more famously than that, we have someone who lived a little bit after Richard, and that would be Sir Thomas More. Thomas More's book on Richard III is one of the most damning out there, and it is not a good picture of Richard at all. Thomas More is where we get basically the basis of Richard III as a Shakespeare play. Shakespeare used Thomas More as a main source for his play, and so this is where you get a lot of discussion of Richard's disability, and specifically his scoliosis, and you also get a description of him just kind of as an absolutely horrible person. His disability figures quite prominently in the play, and also just in general here in Thomas More's work as kind of signaling that Richard's a bad guy. So this is a very problematic source, and if you're pro-Richard at all, you have a lot of beef with Thomas More. I do. I really don't like this. The question with Thomas More is an interesting source. We can talk about him kind of at length because he's an interesting person in his own right. But Thomas More is writing during the days of Henry VIII. And so there's always a question in the Tudor period about people who are writing on Richard. And that question is, are they really writing what they want to write? Or are they writing Tudor propaganda? They're trying to prop up the dynasty that is in power currently and kind of throw down the dynasty that was in power before. That's always the question with anyone who was writing during the Tudor period about any topic, not just Richard. But Thomas More famously dies for his principles. He's executed during the reign of Henry VIII because he is a Catholic and he does not really like when Henry VIII breaks with the Church of Rome. And he sticks to his guns, he sticks to his principles, and he dies for them. So it doesn't really seem, on the one hand, like Thomas More is somebody who towed the line at all. So a lot of people take his writings on Richard III completely seriously because they know kind of the type of person that he was specifically later in life. Other people still think he was writing to get into the Tudor good graces, and so that's up to you. It's worth reading if you're interested in Richard. I think you kind of have to read Thomas More at some point. If you like Richard, your blood will boil, definitely. If you don't like Richard, you'll find a lot to agree with, but this is definitely a product of its time. The way that disability is discussed in Thomas More's Richard III history is abominable. And that really started a link in popular culture between Richard and disability, and also kind of just in general the theme of disability indicating that you are a bad person. And so I have a lot of problems with this text for that alone. But I also just don't like the way it discusses Richard, and I don't think it's true. But y'all know my bias. I love Richard, and I don't really think he did it. But I do think you kind of have to read Thomas More to get a handle on more modern nonfiction. Moving forward in time, we have my favorite biography of Richard III that I just absolutely love. I always recommend this with the caveat that it was written a long time ago, and that is Paul Murray Kendall's Richard III. This was written initially in the 50s, but it has been revised a couple of times. So I think if you can get a good revised version, I just think this is still really valuable. This is one of the first nonfiction books that ever tried to show Richard in a positive light, and it really also tried to rehabilitate his image, specifically in the realm of nonfiction. Fiction had also been trying to kind of rehabilitate Richard's image by this point in time with Josephine Tey's Daughter of Time. So this is a kind of an interesting time period where Richard is being reevaluated. The reason I hesitate to recommend this is that it was written so long ago. Even revisings of the text took place so long ago that this book has been completely outdated by modern scholarship. The main thing that is left out of this, of course, is the rediscovery of Richard's body and how much that rediscovery helped us contextualize everything about Richard. This, to me, is still, for your money, the best biography of Richard from birth to death. I really think it tells a good linear portrait of events. It gives you context for his life, and it's also relatively positive. And in some ways, though I would say this is definitely a more positive nonfiction than others, to me, this book also kind of tries to be as unbiased as possible. It really doesn't tell you everything with a positive slant. It tries to be kind of nuanced, which I think makes this one really valuable. And that leads me into my next recommendation, which would be The King's Grave by Philippa Langley. So this book was written after the rediscovery of Richard's body. Philippa Langley is basically the woman who was in charge of finding Richard's body. And I think this book is really revolutionary for a lot of different reasons. I think anyone who's a fan of Richard's should read this, but I also think if you're just in general interested in historical scholarship, this is an interesting read because it tells you exactly what she did in order to find Richard. If you don't know, Richard was lost, basically, since the time of his burial because of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. The church that Richard was buried in after the Battle of Bosworth, that basically closed down during the dissolution of the monasteries, and thus the location of his body was lost for centuries. So the thing is, when trying to look for Richard, we know what church he was in, we know where he was buried in the church. We just don't really know where the church was. And we also don't know if there's anything remaining. And so what Philippa Langley and her team at the University of Leicester in England did is they started narrowing things down by placing old maps over current maps of the city of Leicester. Truly, it's incredible what she did. Now, if you watched the program that came on back in 2012, maybe it was even 2015 when they reinterred him, you probably have a perspective of Philippa Langley that I think most people would say isn't positive. If you are not pro-Richard, I think you don't like her. She got a lot of flack in that program for being too emotionally invested in the research. And that's basically why I like her. Why are you doing research at all unless you're personally invested? But I do understand it. Those of us who love Richard love him a little bit too much. So she did come across in that program in a certain type of way. If you didn't like that, this book is very clinical, and it's showing you kind of the science behind the history and the science behind what she did. So to me, this is really valuable because I think it also will aid us in future historical discoveries. There are still several kings of England that we haven't found. In fact, I think there's another one that they think is beneath a parking lot, which is where Richard was. Richard was buried beneath a parking lot. And talk about damage, there actually was damage to Richard's feet, and we don't have them because of something that happened during the Victorian period where this old church was located. The discovery of Richard's body, I cannot tell you this enough, is to me one of the biggest things that has happened in my lifetime. And I don't just say that because I simp for Richard. I think this is truly one of the greatest historical discoveries of the last 100 years. And this book really frames Philippa Langley's research as well as her team and the University of Leicester. It really frames it in such an interesting way, and the journey that they took to confirm that the bones, in fact, were Richard's. If you go to the Richard III Center in Leicester, they'll tell you she had the money to dig in one spot. And if she had dug 1 foot to the left, 1 foot to the right, she wouldn't have found him. But she dug in exactly the right location and she found his body. And that's incredible. And it kind of gives me chills right now just thinking about it, the luck that she had. She was meant to find him. And so this book does have a level of passion and love for Richard that might be unrelatable to you if you don't like Richard or if you think he did it. A lot of people who are anti-Richard actually just genuinely hate him. But people who are kind of middling and people who love Richard, you should read this because it's really quite moving to see what she went through. So this to me is one of the more impactful nonfictions that has been written about Richard, and I think it's incredibly important. Now, in terms of a more modern biography, I'm due for a reread of this one, but this is the only biography of Richard that I have read since the discovery and reinterment of his body that I think was really great, and that's Chris Skidmore's. This was published in 2016, I think, so kind of immediately on the heels of the reinterment of Richard's body in 2015. And since this is a more modern biography, it was able to incorporate a lot of what they discovered when they found Richard's body. So for example, when they found Richard's skeleton, they were able to confirm that he did in fact have scoliosis. And so that kind of reframed some of the myths and also some of the assumptions about Richard, because some people thought, well, gee, everything is fake in terms of what Thomas More or Dominic Mancini wrote, because we know that Richard didn't have scoliosis. That's not described anywhere else. Well, when we find a skeleton, we know that Richard did in fact have scoliosis. It just wasn't noticeable. So that's a really important piece of information about Richard that the discovery of the body confirmed. And that kind of automatically dates most nonfiction that was written prior to 2015, because there was a lot of work done on Richard's body confirming a lot of things before his reinterment in 2015. So though the body was discovered in 2012, there were still things being done and talked about in 2013, 2014 that are then outdated by discoveries based on his skeleton. So there was, for example, like the White Queen television show, which I love and I will love forever. That's my favorite Richard. My favorite Richard is in the White Queen television show. He is portrayed as not having scoliosis. And so that was really interesting. That was put out after the discovery of the skeleton. Chris Skidmore's book is one of the first ones to really talk at length about a lot of the discoveries that were found here. And so I think this is valuable as kind of one of the first ones to discuss kind of up-to-date information that we have on Richard. I also think this is a great beginner's book because I think, like Paul Murray Kendall's, this is telling you a linear portrait of events from birth to death. And if you know nothing about Richard, I think you can start here. The interesting thing is, and why I think I also struggle to recommend books based on Richard, he is one facet of a very interesting, very dynamic, and very confusing time period. And so if you're just reading about Richard, you're not getting the whole picture of the time period. That is what makes me struggle with recommending a book, because it's one thing to say you know nothing about Richard. It's another to say you know nothing about the Wars of the Roses. And your knowledge of Richard and your enjoyment of a Richard biography will be aided by knowing more about the time period that he was living in. I think this book gave you enough background on the Wars of the Roses to really help you out. So this is one that I definitely recommend. I would like to reread this one because I can't really remember where Chris Skidmore fell on the scale of loving or hating Richard. So this is a book that I'm definitely due for a reread of. I really wanted to cap this at 5 books, but I think we can't do this video without talking about 2 giants in the realm of Wars of the Roses nonfiction currently. I would say these are kind of the more popular scholars in the modern day, and they are on opposite ends of the spectrum. So one of these is Alison Weir. Alison Weir has a pretty fantastic book written specifically on the princes in the tower. This was published in the 90s, so you might say this is a little bit outdated by this point, especially because we don't have the scholarship from the rediscovery of Richard's body. But Alison Weir 100% believes Richard did this. And so she spends the majority of this book telling you the ways in which Richard could have killed them, and also how he stood to gain from it. It's important to get this perspective because Alison Weir is a pretty phenomenal historian, and objectively speaking, I think even those of us that love Richard will tell you the odds are pretty high that he did it. So I think this is an interesting nonfiction, and it's a great one because it's looking specifically at this mystery, which, if we're honest, people who are interested in Richard III are interested in this mystery first and foremost, I would say, before they're interested in him. So if you're someone who's looking for answers on the princes in the tower, this is a good book because she does also discuss the other theories that people had for who killed the princes. And those to me are so fun and crazy to think about and to discuss. So I think this is a really great book, even though I don't agree with her. And I think she is really anti-Richard to a fault. Even when the opportunity is there to be nice to him, she doesn't take it. So I have some issues with her and with her scholarship, but I still think this is a pretty phenomenal book. The other scholar that I want to talk about is Matthew Lewis, and he is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum to Alison Weir. To him, Richard couldn't have done this. And so he is very pro-Ricardian, and Matthew Lewis has come up a lot in the past couple of years. I used to interact with him some here on YouTube, and I really, really like him. But he's come up in the past couple of years. He now works with History Hit with Dan Snow, and he's kind of moved out of just the realm of Richard III. But for a long time, that's really what his focus was. And so he has several books on Richard III and on the princes in the tower. And he's a figure who shows up quite a bit now in the documentaries about Richard and about the princes in the tower. And I think he's very well spoken. He's a big member of the Richard III Society. I think he's an ideal historian to start with if you're open to being pro-Richard, because I think he's so easy to read. He and Alison Weir are interesting to talk about together because they are both so immensely readable. I think that's the problem with nonfiction, and that's kind of the intimidation factor that a lot of people have, is they think this is going to be dense, and it's going to talk about things in a way that make me feel stupid. I think that was kind of my assumption about nonfiction before going in, but they are writing more popular nonfiction, and so I think it's accessible. I think it's easy to read. So again, if you're open to being pro-Richard, or if you already are, I think Matthew Lewis is a fun one to read. His theories for who killed the princes in the tower are some of the most interesting and entertaining to me. So I think that's fun. I really want there to be another book about the princes in the tower, and specifically about all the theories that various people have, because that to me is almost more fun than anything else, because some people believe just the craziest theories of all time. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of this other than just my ranting and raving about Richard. I love Richard, and so this was very, very difficult to do. This was the hardest video, I think, to plan for me, just because Richard is such a contentious figure. Now, the other figures that I'll talk about in this series, I think could also be described as contentious, but the historians play a little bit more fairly than they do with Richard. Normally with Richard, you're getting one of two things. You're getting he's a saint, you're getting he's terrible, he's a murderer, and you really don't get anything that toes the line in between, which would be more valuable to you, frankly. But I hope that you enjoyed this. I would love to know down below if you think Richard did it or not. Tell me your Richard theories. I love Richard, but I'm open to criticism on him. I'm trying to be open to criticism on him, let me correct that, because it is still very hard for me, but I do love him. But I would love to know down below if you have read any of these as well, if you have Richard III suggestions. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.